You know, it's kind of wild to think that a single idea from way back in the 4th century could get so powerful that it almost tore one of the world's biggest faiths completely in two. This was an idea that basically forced Christianity to stop, take a hard look in the mirror, and decide once and for all who exactly Jesus Christ was supposed to be. This is the story of Arianism. And believe it or not, it all kicked off with one simple question. Right here, this is it. Was Jesus Christ actually God? I mean, this wasn't just some dusty theological footnote for scholars to argue about. No, this was a full-blown crisis that shook the very foundations of the faith, and how they answered it would go on to define Christian belief for the next 2,000 years. So here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll dig into the dangerous new idea that lit the fuse. Then, we'll get into why it was such a massive deal. After that, we'll see how the church drew a line in the sand, how that whole fight actually created the creeds so many people know today, and finally, where you can still hear the echoes of this ancient debate. Okay, so our story really gets going with this one guy, Arius. He was a priest over in Alexandria, Egypt. And look, he wasn't some villain trying to burn Christianity to the ground. He honestly thought he was defending one of its most important ideas, that there's only one God. But the conclusion he came to, well, it was totally radical. Arianism, in a nutshell, is this. It's the belief that Jesus wasn't fully and eternally God. Arius was teaching that the Son of God wasn't eternal like the Father was. Instead, he was a creature. Now, sure, he was the most perfect, most amazing creature God ever made, but he was still made. So Arius's logic kind of follows three main points. First, since the Son was begotten, he couldn't be eternal. This led to his most famous, or infamous, saying, there was a time when he was not. And that leads to the second point. If he wasn't eternal, then he wasn't truly divine like the Father. He was a created being, literally made out of nothing. And third, if he's a creature, then there's no way he could be of the same stuff as his creator. He was more like a lesser, secondary God. And right here, you can really see the battle lines being drawn. The mainstream Orthodox belief was that the Son was God from God, always part of the Godhead. The Arians, though, were adamant that he was created. The whole massive debate eventually came down to one single letter in Greek, homoousios, which means of the same substance, versus homoousios, meaning of a like substance. Was Jesus the same as God or just kind of similar? Everything, and I mean everything, depended on that one difference. So why was this such a huge deal, right? I mean, wasn't this just a bunch of theologians arguing over philosophy? Nope, absolutely not. For the early church leaders, Arianism wasn't just a mistake. It was a poison that could undo the entire Christian faith from the inside out. Here's what was really at stake: salvation. The absolute core of Christian belief is that humanity is saved because of what Jesus did. But, and this is a huge but, if Jesus was just a creature, even the most perfect one, his sacrifice wouldn't be infinite. It wouldn't be enough to bridge the massive gap between finite humans and an infinite God. The thinking was, only God can save us. So if Jesus isn't God, well, the whole plan just collapses. You know, the biggest enemy of Arianism, a guy named Saint Athanasius, he just nailed it with this quote. The whole idea was that for humanity to share in God's divine life, to be deified, God himself had to become one of us. A bridge had to be built from God's side over to ours. If the one building that bridge was just another creature, that bridge would never reach the other side. This whole controversy just exploded. It spread like wildfire across the Roman Empire, causing riots and splitting communities right down the middle. The church had to act. This wasn't something they could just agree to disagree on. And what followed was this epic showdown of church councils, powerful emperors, and brilliant theologians. Things got serious fast. In 325 AD, the Emperor Constantine himself got involved. He called the first ever Universal Council of the Church at a place called Nicaea to try and settle this thing. But, spoiler alert, the fight was far from over. Athanasius, the hero for the Orthodox side, was kicked out of his own city and exiled 5 different times as different emperors took power. It wasn't until 381, that's almost 60 years later, that another big council in Constantinople finally slammed the door on Arianism inside the empire. Back at that first council, Nicaea, the bishops knew they needed a word that the Arians couldn't twist or misinterpret. See, the Arians were really good at finding Bible verses and explaining them in a way that fit their view. So the council picked a word that isn't even in the Bible, a philosophical term, homoousios, of the same substance. It was like a theological firewall. Either Jesus was made of the exact same divine stuff as the Father, or he wasn't. There was just no wiggle room. And this right here is the killer line from the creed they wrote. Begotten, not made, a direct shot at Arius's idea that Jesus was a creature, and then the final blow, homoousios with the Father. That one word locked in the idea of Christ's full divinity for good.
And let's not forget the human cost of all this. For being so stubborn about defending that one word, homoousios, Athanasius spent years and years of his life in exile, run out of town by emperors who were on the Arian side. His entire life was basically one long battle over this single doctrine.
So what came out of this massive struggle wasn't just about defeating a heresy. In the process of fighting Arianism, the Church actually hammered out the very language it would use to define its most central beliefs for all time.
It's incredible, really. When millions of Christians around the world recite the Nicene Creed in church today, they're actually reciting the battle lines that were drawn against Arius. God from God, light from light, true God from true God. Every single one of those phrases is a direct counterpunch to Arianism. It's a declaration that Jesus isn't some lesser being, but that he is fully God. So that council in 381 settled it, right? Arianism disappeared from the Roman Empire. But did the idea itself ever really go away? Not quite. Its core message keeps popping up again and again, just in different forms. Well, yes and no. Arianism as that specific organized historical movement, yeah, that's long gone. But the basic idea at its heart, this denial that Christ is fully divine, that's a theme that just keeps coming back throughout history. Now, according to the sources, you can see beliefs that are pretty similar to Arianism in several modern groups. For example, Jehovah's Witnesses teach that Jesus is a created being, specifically Michael the Archangel. Some scholars have described Mormon theology as being fundamentally Arian in how it sees the sun. But maybe the most common modern echo is something you hear all the time, the idea that Jesus was just a great moral teacher, but not God. At its core, that's the same impulse that drove Arianism. And so often the debate comes right back to the Bible. Just take this one verse from Colossians. Arians, both back then and today, will look at the phrase firstborn of all creation and say, see, he was the first thing created. But the Orthodox view is that firstborn isn't about time. It's a title of rank, of inheritance. Like a firstborn son in a royal family, Jesus has authority over all creation. In fact, the very next verse says all things were created through him, which would make him the creator, not part of creation. So when you boil it all down, the Arian crisis pushes us right back to that huge central question about salvation. It's the same question Athanasius was willing to get exiled for, over and over again. If Jesus is anything less than true God from true God, then what real power do his life and his death actually have? This ancient debate is a powerful reminder that the answer to that one question, who is Jesus? Well, it really does change everything.